All right, welcome back to Firewall. I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. My guest today is Reshma Saujani, and Reshma is someone that we've known each other for 10 years?
Forever.
Longer than that? So I met you when you were running Girls Who Code.
Yep.
And since then, you've built that into this like massive organization and you did the real trick, which was you figured out how to make it functional without you.
Yes.
And then you started Moms First,
Yep.
Which is what we're going to talk about today. But yeah, thanks for coming on. And you've been like, so you live this life, let's start at 50,000 feet, right?
Okay.
Where, you're engaged in politics, you're a super active mom, and you create these organizations that like have real world impact. Like the thing that I always liked about Girls Who Code is it's not this like another white paper think tank. It was like teaching tangible skills to people who they then were able to make their lives meaningfully better as a result. So before we started recording, you asked me what I was up to, and I went through the list of stuff, and you're like, how do you make it all work? So how do you do all these things?
I mean, it's kind of so much what you said, right? Like I hire really smart people and we work as a team, and I kind of plug in. I know what my strengths are now, right? Like I'm good at raising money. I'm good at messaging. I'm good at like year 1, 2, and 3, right? Of putting the thing together. Mm-hmm. Like everything I've built has come from a place of like curiosity, right? Like why is it like that? Or why is that problem like that? And then I find really smart people to kind of build with.
And then what was the point where you're like, okay, I've done what I can at Girls Who Code. The truth is, and by the way, it takes a lot of self-awareness. I find this on the venture side all the time. Founders who don't know when it's time to move on, right? Because the truth is, as you said, going from 0 to 1 or even 0 to 3 is a different skill set than like 4 to 7. So what was that moment of realization? And was it because like you fucked something up, or was it just because one day you're like, oh, they're just humoring me in the meeting, they don't really need me here? And then how did that lead to the realization that led to Moms First?
Look, I mean, I think when I started Girls Who Code, I had just lost, I lost my congressional race, I lost my public advocate race, and I just wanted to serve. And I grew up with a generation of like being in politics was the way to like truly serve.
Literally, if you take every public advocate for the next 1,000 years, they will have less impact than Girls Who Code.
But I didn't know, and I didn't know that then, right? And so I lose this race and I'm like, you know what? Like, I'm going to show them. I'm going to show them that I can make a difference too. Even if you didn't elect me, like I can do this. Yep. It's almost like every athlete, like if you look at like the greatest athletes in the world, they always had like a team they didn't get picked for, right? Or something that gave them a chip on their shoulder that they said, you watch.
Michael Jordan didn't make his high school team.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of like that energy going into Girls Who Code. And so like I was like, you know what? I'm going to teach millions of girls. Like every single one, I'm going to teach them. I'm going to build it. I'm going to create it. And then, because when I first started Girls Who Code and started building it, I had this idea, like a lot of people, that nonprofits are super sleepy.
Right.
Like you can't really get anything done. And so I built Girls Who Code like a tech startup, right? Having KPIs based on scale, how many kids we're going to teach, how much money we're going to raise. And, in 10 years, I raised $100 million. We taught 600,000 kids to code. We had basically built a model, right? That every single, county, town, and parish I had done it. And then the pandemic hit. And, during the pandemic, a lot of women and girls organizations got shut down because, for Girls Who Code, our model was to put, clubs in classrooms in schools that were now shut down, have summer camps in tech companies that were closed, and, build programs in colleges that were shut. So everywhere and place that we taught was closed. And we had to kind of make a decision of like, is this pandemic thing happening for a while? Do we need to pivot and think about how we do this virtually, or do we just ride it out? And my team and I made the right decision, which is like, we got to build a virtual product. Yeah. And so the point is I had to build Girls Who Code again during the pandemic. And so by then I was like, I'm done. Right. Like, meaning like I have learned this skill set.
What was the end result of the virtual product?
It's crushed. It basically taught more kids with the same, these results are coming out now.
Did you go back to the old model as well when schools reopened?
No, we didn't.
This was so much more efficient.
It was so much more efficient. Look, I think we still find ways to bring girls together. We did Code Fair last year. We have, like programs where we kind of have people kind of come together. We have job fairs, et cetera. But I think the point is that, because the theory was that girls, and it was my theory, quite frankly, girls did not want to learn virtually, that they needed to be in a room together. They need to fail. They need to see each other. They need to create. And that was important because, what we did so much more even than coding was we did healing. Like you had black girls and white girls come together, girls from the Bronx and Brooklyn come together. You had girls that were coming out, in our programs together, girls who had never met someone who was Muslim before. So it's like that community was also something that was so beautiful about Girls Who Code. But the coding aspect, was the
What
same.
made you think, so like, how old were your kids during the pandemic?
So my son, Sean, was 5, and then Sai was just born. He was born January 25th.
Okay, so in a weird way, you got lucky in that they weren't really even expected to try to do real school during the pandemic because, my kids, like, it was a fucking disaster.
Yeah.
And I think my instinct would have been like, this is the last direction to go in because look how, like, my kids go to a great fancy school
Yeah.
and it's still terrible.
Yeah.
There's no way that could work. You have friends, obviously, who had older kids who were experiencing the misery of at-home school. Like, you must have been hearing that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, listen, my experience was crap, and I was out there too being like, open up the schools, right? As like an activist, because the fact that you thought that, like, I had to log on Sean on Zoom like every hour. The fact that I could work and do that, and that we were expecting like millions of parents to do that. I also see, like, for me, the anxiety that it's created in my son. And we were lucky. Nahal and I put a pod together for some of our neighborhood kids. So Sean was good because he was in a pod.
Right.
But a lot of
You
parents.
stayed in the city?
We stayed in the city.
I wish I had done that in retrospect. We went upstate, which made sense, right?
Yeah.
It was a logical thing to do. And it was my daughter was in 8th grade when it started, and it was so isolating. Like, to get a Coke was a 2.5 mile walk, that the psychological damage was vastly greater than, we didn't know at the time, but the actual risk of COVID. Because if you didn't have pre-existing conditions, you were willing to get a vaccine, you were okay.
Yeah. But look, I mean, I think that's not to say that I also miss and think our Girls Who Code in-person classrooms were also powerful and important, because we're missing that aspect of girls actually being able to come together. And we think about that. But from a business perspective, we were running the largest summer program in the country, and that's expensive and hard. And so from an outcomes perspective, we were getting the same results.
So how many kids does Girls Who Code now train?
So we're still basically, we've taught over 650,000, girls to code. So, we're anywhere, we're still training tens of thousands of girls every year, new girls. Our rates of graduation are high in terms of most of our girls go on to major or minor in computer science. So, like, it works.
So you kind of get through
right
the redesign, relaunch, everything
so I'm in
else.
and
then what makes you, how long, was there a break between that and Moms First?
No.
Or what was the moment where you're like, oh, I need to be doing this?
Right. So I'm here, I'm rebuilding, I'm looking at the world, and I'm like, oh my God, right? I now have a newborn and a 5-year-old. And remember when the pandemic started, about 51% of the labor force was female for the very first time in history. And I'm starting to see, again, all these women I know, women I'm reading about, getting pushed out of the workforce because daycare centers are shut down and schools are shut down.
Right.
And, traditionally 2/3 of the caregiving work have always been done by women, whether it's in the United States, Canada, or anywhere else. And the thing that, like, kind of made me realize that I needed to, like, really step off and solve this problem was my students. So half the students I teach are under the poverty line. And so many of them were on their way to major in computer science in college, but because their mothers were essential workers, our nurses, our teachers, instead of going to college, they had to stay home and take care of their siblings. Yeah. And so you saw this generational cycle of poverty. We loved, like, you see Michelle Obama going to Africa and India and, like, talking about how, like, let girls learn, that, the reason why girls don't have the same education rates is because of caregiving responsibilities. But the same damn thing happens in our own country.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa. And I started, just like 10 years ago at Girls Who Code, started digging in of like, wait, why are we the only nation that doesn't have paid leave? Why are we the wealthiest nation that puts the least amount of money into childcare? Like, why is our sister?
What was your conclusion as to why? Before you started all this?
It's funny. I feel like I'm still in the process of figuring that out because, I was reading an article, like, in World War II, when the men went out to war, we decided we got to figure out how we can replace them with women. Yeah. And so we had universal childcare, right? We had childcare systems that the government had we had paid leave, right? And then you had an increase of 400% of women back into the workforce. When the men came back, we decided to shut all those programs down. France decided to keep them open. So part of it, I think, is tradition, where we expect women in their role to be. And, if you surveyed back, in the 70s to the 40s to now, the percentage of Americans that believe that someone, i.e. a woman, should be at home taking care of their kids, it's quite high still.
So how do you square, and your family's not originally American, I mean, no one's, I guess,
Yeah.
but, I'm first generation
Yeah.
American. Were these two things at once, right? In some ways, we're the most innovative, forward-thinking, experimental culture in history. And then in some ways, we are so deeply puritanical and traditional and kind of Christian in a way that like things are just completely logical, like paid leave just don't exist. How does that fit in your mind?
I mean, I think we have to reconcile that because I think to me, when I think about this issue, it's not about it's the right thing to do is to give women paid leave. It's just the smart thing. Right. Like, I mean, if you think like you have a daughter, right? 70% of high school valedictorians are girls. The majority of those that are getting their bachelor's degree are women. And even in tech, right, it's like you essentially have parity till women turn 35. And then you have this leaky pipeline. Right. So to me, it's inefficient, right? From an economic perspective, like you're just losing out on talent by not fixing the childcare problem. Right. It's dumb.
Well, right. I think about like, and again, we're not a typical business, but at our venture fund or consulting firm, our leave policies are not because we want to make the world a better place. It's because it's the best way long-term for us to retain talent. By the way, maternal and fraternal, like both, right? Because at the end of paternity, and people use them both because at the end of the day, if we want to be able to recruit the best people and employ them over a long period of time, this is the logical thing to do.
And this is, we just did a report that came out. It's shocking that it's like the first ever report that's quantifying the ROI of companies providing childcare benefits. And it's like 425%. I mean, and this is like UPS, Synchrony, fast retailing. And so it pays for itself. Childcare pays for itself because as you've seen, and I've seen both as CEOs, if you allow people to be there at their biggest moments, the birth of a child, the death of a parent, if you're there for them and you're like, I got you, they'll never leave. And so the amount of money that you save and not having to replace those workers is ginormous.
Everything else. Okay, so you realize this.
Yeah.
But then there's, everyone every day realizes shit that's wrong, and that's different than doing something about it. So how did you go from sort of 0 to 1?
Well, I realized this, and I realized that like in the past 10 years of like building Girls Who Code and failing and making a lot of mistakes, I actually have a skill set, which is I know how to be a social entrepreneur. I know how to take a problem from jump and how to galvanize excitement around it, how to raise money around it, and how to build a program around it. Yeah. And, at first I thought when I started Moms First, I'm like, oh, this is going to be easy. Like I raised $100 million. First I was like, so much harder, right? Our social investment or philanthropic investment in girls is much easier than when we invest in women, which was like a big aha for me. Secondly, unlike Girls Who Code, where I had a product, right? I was going to sell a summer camp where girls would learn how to code. Here I was building an advocacy organization, which as you know, right? Totally different. The third thing is I didn't really appreciate, like you said, this kind of tension that we have between our traditional values, right? And the fact that we are, the most powerful nation in the world. And like talking about that, making sense to people, both on the left and the right. When I started Moms First, my friends on the left were like angry at me. What about the dads? Why are you mobilizing around moms? And then people on the right were like, well, wait a minute, like, where's our place? The idea that I wanted to build an organization that wasn't political, right. That I was again, like, to this day, I still can't get money from a handful of foundations that we know because the idea of both working with business and then working with people on the right is like, this is why, quite frankly, we are divided.
All those foundations, somebody made the money to get them in the first place.
Yeah.
Did you think about kind of where the policy change would have to happen and kind of what your chances were at a municipal level versus state versus federal?
Yeah, I think so. When I started Moms First, it was when Biden had just taken, just gotten elected. It was his first 100 days. The first cheeky thing we did was like take a full page ad being like, moms don't work for free. We're not your social safety net. This is what you need to do. Right. And so, paid leave and childcare were part of the plan in Build Back Better, and they were quite frankly, some of the only policies that didn't get actually passed, which is also shows you how much we regard moms. That like in the depths of the pandemic, when you're just seeing it, every American was seeing our broken childcare system, feeling it. It wasn't enough for Congress to be like, we got to do something here. They bailed out the airlines, they did something about climate, but this was the one thing that didn't happen. People love to blame Joe Manchin. It's not just Joe Manchin, from my perspective, right? It's like there's something fundamental where we know that moms will do it for free. And so then, like, where we're going to put our dollars, we don't rise to the top of the list.
Right. And do you think overall, like, we've looked at some startups that take advantage of laws that reimburse adult children for giving care to their parents. And it feels like maybe our notions of care might change a bit, in part just because of the demographic changes where we have this massive baby boomer, population that's going to need care and change. Do you think that between the kind of work that you're doing and that in 20 years we'll see this stuff very differently? Or do you
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the explosion of femtech and like childcare as a business, I mean, you early investor in Uber, right? It's like that. It's like the way we think about childcare is so antiquated. Right? The idea that you have to go drop off a child at a childcare center. It can only be X amount of adults there. It's gotta, it can't be on the, it's gotta be on the bottom floor, right? All the ways that we think about how it's supposed to be done. It's why we don't pay our childcare workers their the fair amount that they deserve for the work that they're actually doing. That reason why 50% of Americans live in childcare deserts, because most people who run childcare centers can't afford to keep the doors open. So we have to radically shift the way that we think about this and encourage more entrepreneurs to go into this space and figure out how you rebuild the business model of childcare.
So how do you divide your kind of effort and time between pushing for legislative and policy change that could take effect now and kind of changing these social norms or helping get companies going that, will take 10 years to really succeed?
Yeah, and this is like, Melinda Gates and Pivotal were kind of early investors in helping me kind of think through this. The first thing I think I thought about is what's the open space? Like, there have been a lot of dead bodies, a lot of active bodies, and people have tried and are trying. So what can I contribute in this moment that can help get us to a win? So the first thing was, to me, people were not engaging business at all. Yeah. Right? And that's what I learned at Girls Who Code, which was like almost 99% of the $100 million we raised was from the private sector. We were working hand in hand. They needed talent. We wanted to close the gender gap. So similarly here, it was the same thing, right? You had tight labor markets with very talented people leaving, business desperate for talent and trying to, and so saying to them, hey, look, this is the thing. Instead of free gym memberships, right? It's like invest in childcare. So we built a national business coalition on childcare, one of the first ever. We now have over 200 companies that are part of this. We partner with, the Chamber of Commerce, right? Like, we have different partners essentially that are kind of sit on the right and in the middle and on the left that are engaging business and helping kind of solve this problem. And so now if we ever get a legislative shot federally again, business is there, and we're doing the same thing, and we have a pilot we're running in New Jersey, on engaging business on childcare. So mobilizing business, I think the middle part of it is the movement. So we now have 1.1 million members. 40% of our members are from Republican districts. So we're mobilizing those women.
What do you ask the members to do, and how do you keep them engaged?
So it's a great thing, right? This was the biggest challenge. Moms are so damn busy.
Yeah.
And so the ask would be like, come march in Washington. They're like, yeah, no, I can't, right? But so we've been testing over the past year and a half, what are they comfortable doing? So we're going over the childcare cliff. Send a note to your congressperson, right? Right now we had our first community meeting. We've organized this volunteer corps called the Motherhood. We had 700 people show up. Like, it was just bananas. But we're testing. Right now we're running a campaign to get CNN to ask a question about childcare on the debate. Right. Super easy. Sign a petition.
What do you think? So we know what Biden would say, obviously. What do you think Trump would say if asked that question?
I don't know.
Has he said anything about this issue?
I don't. It's a great question. I don't think he has.
Because on one hand, I guess he really likes the idea that he's a traditionalist.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he also sees himself as a good business person, whether he is or not.
Yeah.
He sees himself that way, and it is sort of such an obvious, argument from a business perspective. Yeah, it's kind of like that. The only as much as obviously I'm like you pulling for Biden. the only thing I tell people sometimes with Trump is you don't really know, right?
Yeah.
Like he might actually be okay with your issue
Yeah.
because it's weird in some way.
I mean, it's interesting because from a polling perspective, 86% of Republicans want someone to do something about childcare and paid leave too. So there's no actual like, it's not even like abortion where we thought abortion was, where there's a little bit of a divide. Now there's not that much, right? Now it's
2-1
right,
at most.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's one of those issues. So you have to ask yourself like, why aren't they doing something about it? And I think it's just about it seeming still like a social issue and not an economic issue.
Yeah, and it's funny. I'm hosting a dinner tomorrow night, mobile voting that you're attending. We'll talk about this tomorrow night. But it's also the 86% of people in your poll aren't necessarily the people who reliably vote in every single Republican, state Senate primary, city council primary, congressional primary, and so just like abortion and guns and immigration and almost every other issue, where the public stands writ large and where primary voters stand aren't always the same thing.
Yeah.
And so we have this cognitive dissonance that results in really bad public policy.
And I don't think anyone's really asked Republican women, what do you think about childcare? Shockingly, right? So it's like having the data and making sure we're, from a language perspective, that we're talking about it the right way. The other thing that's really interesting is like, one of the reasons why in Germany they kind of moved the pendulum along on paid leave and childcare was because a lot of the legislators had daughters who then turned 28, 29, 30, and they had the childcare problem. Because remember, a lot of the folks that are in Washington, they might have a partner who stays at home, so they never actually really experience this, but now their daughters are.
Right, and now it's a different thing.
And that's what we have to take advantage of.
What do you think about, so on the abortion side that you mentioned before, the referendums have done incredibly well, right?
Yeah.
And they're in some ways Biden's best hope of winning Nevada and Arizona. Just given how this issue polls, there's got at least a thought that those same voters would clearly come out for this too.
Absolutely.
Are you looking at referendums?
Yeah, or I mean, just looking to, so we focus a lot on, people are focusing a lot on what's going to happen federally, but like, Claudia Golden, who, won the Nobel Peace Prize, she said this to me the other day. She said, workers' comp never passed federally. It passed in the states.
Right.
And so her, as someone who's been studying this and working on this issue, she's like, I actually think the movement and the change is going to happen in the states before it happens federally.
90% of the work that we do, whether it's political consulting, venture, philanthropic, is all state.
Yeah.
Because that's where you can get shit done. Like, I won't invest in a startup if the regulatory unlock has to be federal.
Yeah.
Because then it's totally this binary thing, and unless a fucking miracle happens and Congress acts, I lose. Whereas with 50 states, we'll figure it out somewhere. Yeah. Right? There's a path. There's always a path.
And it's funny. We launched a tool, paidleave.ai. I had reached out to Sam about this idea that I had about how you could use generative AI to increase the amount of paid leave claims that happen in the states. So, in paid leave, there's 13 states that have passed the law, but it hasn't happened federally. And part of what I would argue is that, like, if you have, like, in New York, it says less than 2% of people that are eligible actually file a claim because government sucks at customer service. They make it so damn hard. Right. But then Washington looks at what's happening in these 13 states and says, well, wait a minute, no one's actually using this benefit anyway. Is it not a priority?
Right. It's funny. You have to sometimes, I remember in the Bloomberg world, Mike ran a campaign to get New Yorkers to fill out the earned income tax credit forms.
Yep.
Not because the city per se as an entity got any money, but just billions of dollars of our tax money flowing to Washington started coming back. Yeah. Simply because we filled the fucking form.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And this is sort of the same.
Yep. The same thing. And it's a great use case for what generative AI can do.
Right. I assume that people are at least experimenting with the notion of where AI can do childcare itself. Is there anything interesting? Is it at all a feasible concept?
Yeah. No. There's Milo that's out there, Ojai, right? That's basically helping parents reduce the cognitive load.
Okay, so like, what does it do specifically?
So like, it essentially like sends you, if you're in a family and like you're a mom, right? And you're like, I got to buy new shoes and then I got to drop them off at class and then I got to send it for a play date and then I got to do this. It essentially organizes the family to have a more essentially more organized.
Yeah, okay. So
right? Saves you time. Right. Exactly.
Right. And do you think, because education and childcare obviously are sort of two sides of the same coin, when you look at least when I look at AI, there is tremendous potential for harm, no doubt, but also tremendous potential for good. And it seems like education is really one of those 100%. Use cases. And given the work you did in Girls Who Code, like I would imagine that, every girl that you taught, just like just every individual, has a slightly different learning style. And some
Yep.
people are better verbally, and some visually, and some writing.
Yep.
Do you think that AI will eventually get to a place where the teaching that we do, whether it's through what you guys do, Girls Who Code, or a more traditional classroom, can get a lot more effective?
I think so. Like look, I'm a big believer in aspirational AI. Yes, there's risks and safety concerns, and we have to think about that. But in many ways, we fear-mongered when, the internet came out, and that's why we have a gender gap, quite frankly. Or that's why 44% of Americans making under $30,000 a year still don't have broadband internet, because we didn't think about this as a problem we have to solve. The same thing can happen with generative AI if we don't actually focus on access. To me, it's how do we get a ChatGPT license to every single Title I school so they can play, tinker, build, and create? And I do believe that when it comes to education, what Sal Khan's doing, what we're doing, at Girls Who Code, and figuring out how you incorporate AI into education and give you a personalized, tutor, essentially, that helps individualize your child's challenges is a good thing, right? It's AI at its best is an augmentation of human intelligence, and that's a great use case for it.
Yeah, totally. All right, so last question, as I mentioned before we started, my daughter just graduated high school last week. She's going off to college. What's your advice for her, right? You've managed to seemingly figure out life in every way successfully. So what do you wish when you were 18? She turns 18 in 2 weeks. Someone had told you.
Fail, 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 fail. I remember, Brad, when I ran for Congress for the first time in 2010. I was running against Maloney, this upstart. I had no idea what I was doing. And it was the hardest thing I had ever done. The press was mean to me. I had to raise money from people who didn't think I was going to win. I had to build a campaign from start to finish. I failed spectacularly. I had $10,000 in my bank. I was broke. I was humiliated. Nobody was picking up the phone and calling me. But I learned how to pick myself back up. And had I not had that formative failure, in my early 30s, I would not be doing what I'm doing today. So don't play it safe. Go find the hard things that scare the shit out of you, right? And pursue them. And I think for us as parents, I think about this with my kids, let's not help them, right? Throw them into and I think it's because now.
How do you think, okay, so you guys as a family obviously have had a lot of success professionally and financially. So, because I struggle with this too, right? I didn't grow up with, first generation American, didn't grow up with a lot of money. I worked in government, all those years, I didn't make any money. And I'm sort of struggling with this now, right? Because I had to say that. I failed a ton, and that's what led to some stuff I've been able to achieve. And I feel good about the fact that what I have, I was able to sort of help do. At the same time, I never seem to choose to deny my kids anything, right?
Yeah.
So how do you know how to think through that?
Yeah, Nahal and I have different perspectives, right? He would definitely make the phone call to get Sean the internship. I would not.
I should mention that Reshma's husband and I worked together.
Yeah, and so one of the things I used to watch some of my wealthier donors do is they would have their kids collect their receipts. They gave them an allowance and a budget, but you would have to literally submit receipts. And so they had that sense of what actually things cost. I was thinking about my father the other day. My dad, I also grew up working class. They came here as refugees. I didn't have much. But my father was always thinking about how to teach me lessons. And he was a civil engineer. I remember one day he took me to the home of of one of his clients who was disabled, who had built an entire house. And my dad had me sit there, walk through the house, talk to this incredible gentleman. And the lesson that he was trying to teach me is just because you can't physically walk doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your brain.
Right. Yeah, look what that guy did.
And look what that guy did. Right. And so I think we have to think about all those opportunities we have to take to our kids and teach them these lessons.
Right. Which doesn't require money one way or the other.
Which doesn't require money one way or the other. So maybe they are getting the fabulous vacation, but that is balanced with the fact that, we're going to a homeless shelter. You're being exposed to different things, different countries, different people, different experiences. You understand what it's like not to have much, to have poverty. And if you have, you're learning empathy at the youngest of possible ages and grace.
Right. How do people get involved with Moms First? How do they help
go to momsfirst.us. Follow us on Instagram at Moms First, Reshma Saujani, and join our motherhood. Get involved with the movement. And look, this isn't just for moms.
Yeah, that's what I was about to
40% of my funders are men. And oftentimes there are people who had single moms or see what's happening with their daughters. Like, we're in this movement together. I believe that as a social entrepreneur, you kind of build for the most vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? So if you can solve for a single mom from the Bronx, like, you'll build a society that's good for everybody.
Yep, there you go. Reshma Saujani, thanks for joining us.
Amazing. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Firewall is recorded in my bookstore, P&T Knitwear, located at 180 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We'd love to hear from you with questions, feedbacks, or idea for a guest. Just email me at bradley@firewall.media or find me on LinkedIn. And to keep up with what's on my mind and my latest writing, please follow my new Substack at bradleytusk.substack.com. Thanks again for listening.